Welcome everyone to our International UX webinar. Glad to be with you all this morning. Octavia, you could just go, thank you. So I am here joined with Anne-Laure and Octavia. So I am Katie, I am a key account manager. So I manage the commercial side of business at Ferpection, and notably our relationship with our customers, especially our international customers.
Hi everyone, I'm Anne-Laure. I'm a UX researcher at Ferpection. So I run UX studies and often work on international studies, and it's very nice to be with you all today.
And hello everybody, I'm Octavia Kawase. Like Anne-Laure, I'm a UX researcher and I worked on several international projects too, and I'm really happy to present this presentation today.
So today we will look at the following topics. So why adapt your interface to local culture, explore the cultural frameworks for carrying out an international study. We'll take you through some examples of UX trends, as well as some of our recent benchmarks and client use cases, and then we'll finish with the Q&A. This presentation is certainly meant to be an introduction. At the end, you'll see that we have some more detailed documentation about specific markets where we've explored UX, and so you can continue to dive into the subjects a little bit more through those examples. And with that, I will pass things over to Octavia to kick us off.
Thank you, Katie. So we will start with this first part, why adapt your interface to the local culture? Because each country has its own culture and each culture has its own specificities. So that's why it's very important to adapt the interface to each specificities of the country. So here we have an example to show you that each country has different cultures. So the Dutch researcher Hert Hofstede, sorry for the pronunciation, create this measurement system to measure the culture of each country. So if we look at this example, we can see, for example, for the short versus long-term perspective, it's very different. In the United States, they are more short-term oriented compared to France or even Japan, which are much more long-term oriented. We can see also that each country has their own way of communicating depending on the cultural context. For example, if we look at Japan, Japan has a higher context in a way that the communication is more sophisticated, more nuanced. The message has to be implicit, not so much straight to the point or not so much explained, because they think that the population has the same knowledge of the context. But if we look at a country that have a lower cultural context, for example, in the United States, the communication has to be much more explicit. It has to be clear and very simple. They like the repetition, and because they want everybody to have the same knowledge of the context, and they don't assume that everybody has it. If we look at another graph, here it's the Erin Meyer graph, we can see that the communication is different in other ways. So some countries are more or less emotionally expressive and more or less confrontational. So if we look at France, in France, the French people like to be more confrontational. They like to criticize in a good or in a bad way, and they are really emotionally expressive. But if we look at Korea or Japan, for example, they prefer to avoid confrontation and to be less emotionally expressive. So it's very important to adapt the wording, the text, the description, the message in the country to make sure that the explanation is adapted to the local population. But what is very important is to have a good balance between localization and standardization. So we saw that localization is very important for the reason we just seen before. So the localization is to adapt the interface to the local culture. So it's to adapt the message, the wording, some graphic elements, but also some secondary feature but don't forget the standardization, so the common structure for all countries. It has to be the same, especially for a brand image. The brand image has to be the same all over the world. And the primary feature of the service or the product also has to be the same. So it's very important, depending on the brand, the project, the restriction, also to find the right balance. And now Katie will explain how we do that at Ferpection.
Great, thanks, Octavia. So just taking a bit of a step back, I'm going to introduce Ferpection in a few words. So we are a UX research consultancy, and our vision of UX is really based on a holistic approach. So for us, a good user experience is going to be the convergence of these three circles. So you have your objectives. This could be something such as conversion. Then you have the feasibility. So this could be constraints such as legal or technical constraints that you may have to adhere to. And then, of course, that green circle is where we see the user needs. So what we do at Ferpection is we really help our clients to understand this green circle, the user needs, which can quickly get lost in the middle of these objectives and feasibility constraints. So concretely, how do we go about doing this? When we carry out a study, we will set up a personalized approach that follows these 4 steps. So the first step is going to be really building a personalized strategy, after which we will put in place, we'll prepare for the study and start the recruitment of the target. Next, we'll conduct the study in which we're going to gather those quality insights. And finally, this culminates in producing our deliverables, so our UX analysis and UX recommendations. So to come back just to an international focus in the next few slides, I'll go a little bit more into detail about how we integrate international needs of the study through these 4 steps. So starting again with our first step, which is this scoping or kickoff phase. This is a moment where we are going to co-construct with our clients. It's a workshop where we'll integrate all of the stakeholders in order to validate objectives, align on the context, explore any assumptions and expectations of the study. And when we're doing an international study, this is the moment where we can identify the limits of international modifications. So to Octavia's point, how far can we go in the localization of a product page, for example? And during this kickoff phase, this is also where we are able to incorporate any specific data relative to a country or a market that will really help us feed the study strategy. After we have done our kickoff, then we move on to this preparation stage. So this is where one of our UX consultants, someone like Emma or Octavia, for example, will write the test protocol or the interview guide or the survey and start the recruitment. So for an international study, of course, if we are carrying out a study where we would require translation, we obviously need to translate into the local language. But above and beyond that translation, there's also a necessity to kind of adapt the recruitment criteria for the country in which we are conducting the study. So we have 2 recent examples of this. So for one, we were doing a study in both France and Japan where we needed to target a certain socio-demographic, which in France is called CSP+. And Japan doesn't have this categorization. So what we had to do is we had to adjust our recruitment to, take into account a specific household income. Another example was we were doing a study around travel habits. So we were looking for a target that travels often. However, often is not the same number for users in France as it was for the users in China. So there's a very different relationship to this habit that we needed to take into account. And this preparatory phase is really important to make sure that we're catering to the international needs to ensure that we're getting usable results at the end of the study. So next, we're carrying out, once we've done the scoping, we have written the protocol and done the recruitment. This is where we're really conducting the study. So again, for an international study, there is certainly a need to be able to communicate and exchange in the local language. For this, our platform is available in 8 languages with the possibility of quickly adding other languages as well. And we also work with a strong network of local partners. Something like this is really important to, for example, when we're moderating, to make sure that we don't lose any information and that we really take into account all of the local nuances. And then our last step, this is when we are really kind of circling back to the objectives that we identified at the beginning of the study and delivering actionable analysis and recommendations. So that could be in the form of wireframes, prioritization, mapping, benchmarks, or really a wide variety of deliverables that we carry out at Ferpection. For an international study, during this analysis phase, it's really key that we have our multicultural team. So I believe we currently have 8 nationalities on our team, as well as, again, that that network of local partners who could really help us in supporting the cultural specificities as we carry out our analysis. So just to wrap things up on how we at Ferpection carry out international research, we have a wide variety, this catalog of methodologies that we use to meet the needs of our clients and carry out successful international UX research. And with that, I'm going to let Octavia speak a little bit more about some of the examples of UX trends.
Thank you, Katie. So yes, let's have a look on few examples of user experience trends in 4 countries: Brazil, Japan, China, and US. So let's start with the habits and behavior. So we can see, like, in all over the world, in most of the country, people prefer to navigate through mobile, but it's even more important in Asia. So if we look at China and Japan, we can see that only a quarter of the population prefer to navigate through desktop. Otherwise, they prefer to navigate on the mobile. This has the consequences on the interface. It has to be adapted to the mobile. If we look at Brazil, we can also see that most of the population has a smartphone, but less than half of the population has a desktop. So it's very important to be mobile first, and especially in this country. Also, let's have a look at the behaviors. So if we look at this graph, we can see that in the United States and in China, users spend about 40 seconds or more on each page, which means that they spend a long time on the page, because 40 seconds is considered as a long time. And that's why we consider this user as engaged user. But on the contrary, if we look at the Japanese user, they spend about 36 seconds per page. So we consider them as zappers users, because they don't spend so much time, because for a second, it's a lot on the navigation. And they don't spend so much time per page, but they scroll more and they visit more pages. That's why for Zapper user, it's important to repeat the information on several pages, because they don't spend so much time, but they will go through different pages. Now let's have a look on interfaces. So here we have an example in the United States with Google. We can see that the interface is very simple, very minimalist style. Lot of white space, only one feature per screen. So the brand, one feature. Here is Google with the search bar, 2 CTAs, and that's it. So it's easy. We know what we have to do when we arrive on that screen. We don't have a lot of options. But if we compare it to Asian screens, here we have an interface in Japan or in China. We can see that the interface, it's very different. It looks heavier compared to the American one. There are a lot of information, not so much white space, many different path entries, a lot of text, a lot of images, and a lot of colors. So it's very different. And this is how a user used to navigate through their local website. If we look at the colors, we can see here that it's different. We have 3 examples: China, Japan, and Brazil. And we can see that it's they use red a lot for different reasons. In Asia, so in China and Japan, they use red because it's associated with celebration, with happiness. So they like to use the red color a lot. But for French or even UK or United States, red color, it's more associated to a bad thing, like an error message. So if we see a red color, it's more that something went wrong, but not in Asia and not in Brazil too, but for a different reason. They prefer to use the reddish color in order to avoid the color green and yellow, because green and yellow are the football jersey color, because they take it from the flag of Brazil. And they use this football jersey when they protest in the street. And we saw that this past year, there was a lot of protest in the street. And they use this jersey to support the president. So in order to avoid any political stance, they prefer to use different colors, such as red, orange, or any reddish colors. Now let's have a look to the structure. So it's very different, and each country prefers to have the structure of the interface adapted to the reading direction. So we can see here, like in China or in the United States, the structure is more horizontal because the reading direction is horizontal. But if we look at Japanese interface, the structure is vertically. So it's divided into columns. We have an example here with Yahoo. We can see that the interface is divided in 3 columns because the reading direction can be vertical in Japan, also horizontal, but also vertical. So it's important to have the structure adapted to the reading direction. Now let's have a look about the browsing. It's very different here again between United States and Asia. So Americans, they like to use the search bar a lot because they want to save time, they want to be very efficient. So they prefer to use the search bar to type directly what they are looking for, a product, for example. That's why we can see that the search bar, it's often fixed on the screen. We have an example here with a Sephora website. So we can see that in the American version, they have the search bar directly where you can type it. In contrary, in France, we use the icon. So we have to click one time before finding the search bar where we can type. In China and in Japan, because the alphabet, it's a little bit complex because one character can mean something, but added with other character, it means something else. They prefer to avoid typing and they prefer to browse through menus or drop-down menus. So it's important to have different category display to allow browsing for Asian users. We can also here see on the graph that in Asia, in China and Japan, they prefer slideshow more than the other countries. So slideshow is the different image you can swipe horizontally. And we have an example in one of our projects. We did a study in 4 different countries, in UK, US, Japan, and China. And we saw that when Asian user arrived on the homepage, they have the instinct to swipe the photo and to see the different photo. Compared to the US and UK, the user, they prefer to scroll and they didn't even swipe and didn't even see the different images that they could see on the homepage. So they don't have the same habits, and slideshow are much more used in Asian interfaces. And now some use. So we can see here that in the United States and in Japan, they like to highlight the purchase, highlight the promotion. So on Coca-Cola website, we can find the product directly on the homepage. Compared to the French website, we can see different categories such as the engagement, history, different brands. And on the McDonald's application, we can see that in the menu in the United States and in Japan, there are the deal, the promotion, the different coupons fixed in the menu. It doesn't exist in the French version. So it's important in the United States and in Japan to highlight all the promotion and the deals. Also, the way we look at others. In Brazil, they like and they love the social networks, especially WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. It's very, very popular in Brazil for different reasons. WhatsApp, they use it to communicate with everyone, with your friends, your family, but also with companies. You can buy directly through WhatsApp. You can buy your groceries through WhatsApp. You can buy your medicine to the pharmacy through WhatsApp. So it's a very important way of communicating and also to purchase. We have an example here with Decathlon here, the website. So the primary feature is to sell sports products and Decathlon, so it's the same, but we can see that the localization is to adapt secondary features such as buying through WhatsApp or communicate through WhatsApp on Decathlon website in Brazil. Also, Instagram, it's important to use if you want to reach a target because it's the second highest country that use Instagram, just behind the United States. So they have a lot of what we call mega influencer because it's the influencer with a lot of followers. And it can be interesting for some brands to do a partnership with this mega influencer in order to reach the target. And also on Facebook and YouTube, there are strong community. They're the biggest esports community in Brazil. And in order to target also this community, it's important to share and post through Facebook and YouTube. In Asia, the way we look at other, it's also important, but for different reasons. In China and Japan, people like to follow the trend. So in China, there are specific applications to see the product review and the experiences to be sure that the Chinese buy the right product. Also in Japan, it's the same. They like to follow the trend and they like to see the most popular item on a website. Here we have an example on Hermes website. They like on the product page to find the different recommendations, the most popular item or what product can be buy with what other product. So it's important to guide the user through the trends in Asia. And now some particularities. So in Japan, about the illustration, it's very different. They are used to manga illustration. They like mascot and stickers. So for Western country, it can be a little bit childish, but in Japan, it's very common to use that kind of visual. In Brazil, as we saw, the mobile is very important. And they create a way of paying through mobiles called the Pix. And it's a QR code that you can send or scan to pay. And it's used in every application and several websites. In the United States, just be careful about the specific unit, especially between UK and US. How you write the dates they opposite the direction between day and month. It's opposite. So in order to avoid any mistake, especially on travel agency website, just be careful on the specific units for each country. And in China, they have what we call super app like WeChat. They can do everything, purchase, contact, communicate through WeChat. So they prefer to to subscribe through a phone number rather than an email. So these are some specificities for a country. And now we'll talk about the benchmark and a client use.
Thank you, Octavia. So to conclude this presentation, we wanted to share a few use cases of studies we did in several countries. So our first example is a study we did a few months ago. So this study, it's a benchmark of UX best practices for luxury e-commerce website. So what we did for this study is that we tested the website of several major luxury brands like Chanel, Burberry, Dior, etc. And for each of these brands, we tested their website in France, in the UK, and in the US. And here, what's interesting to note is that on first glance, the users' feedback were very similar in all these three countries. To give you a few examples, so both in all these three countries, users said that they expect luxury websites to be about more than just buying products. They expect these websites to be very inspirational. They expect these websites to help them to find the right products, for example, by providing complex filtering options. They also expect to have a lot of high-end services offered on the website. So all of this is similar in all three countries. But then if you look a little bit closer, if you look at the details, you get to see that there are actually local differences that are interesting to take into account. So for example, if we look at what services are expected on a luxury website, there are services that are expected everywhere. So for example, number one, having multiple delivery options. So this is equally expected in the UK, the US, and France. But if we look at number four, chatting with a virtual assistant, this is an option that's much more relevant in the UK or in the US than in France. And on the contrary, having the possibility to chat on the phone with a salesperson and advisor to discuss your purchase, it's something that's much more expected in France than in the US, for example, where it's not something people really strongly expect. So it's important for brands to be aware of these differences, because this way they can adapt the types of services that they're going to offer on their website depending on the country. The other example we wanted to share is the Lacoste website. So we tested this website in 3 different countries, Brazil, France, and the US. And more specifically, we tested their product pages. And here, for example, if we look at the Add to Cart button, one thing that was interesting is that French users tended to prefer a more complex version of this button that's large, that has a clear label that says click here to add the product to your cart. Whereas American users, they prefer the simplified version of this button. So it's much smaller, there's no label and just an icon. And it kind of fits with the way American users tend to prefer more minimalist interfaces. Another example, still on this product page, is that there's a client review section on this page. And this section is deemed important in all 3 countries. But the feedback we got is that in Brazil and in the US, this section is much more essential to the purchasing process than in France comparatively. So to conclude the whole presentation in a few words, so what we can say is that in order to really optimize the user experience of a product or service that you want to implement in different countries, the key is really to, as Octavia said earlier, to find the right balance between standardization, so what can be the same everywhere, and localization, so what's interesting to adapt depending on different local needs. And to be able to find this balance, you need to know your users, know their habits, their expectations, and their needs in each of the different countries where you want to operate. So thanks a lot for listening. We hope that it was interesting for you. And if you want to go further, please don't hesitate to download our complete studies. So we have studies about UX specificities in different countries, but also studies about UX specificities in different industries like luxury or retail, for example. So thanks everyone.